The First Crusade. The clash of swords, the clash of civilizations. But it began not with a clash, but with fear, with faith and desperation. Let's talk about the Seljuks. Now, at the close of the 11th century, Europe was a fractured continent. Many kingdoms and duchies, small, often in conflict with one another, and lords lived by war, but war was mostly local. Feuds, petty rivalries. The power to project military force far beyond one's borders just didn't exist. But in the east, far beyond the horizon, the last remnant of Rome, the Byzantine Empire, was crumbling under pressure from a new and powerful enemy, the Seljuk Turks. The Turks had swept across Asia Minor, shattering Byzantine armies and capturing cities one after another. For the Christian world, the most painful loss was not merely territory, but access to the Holy Land. Jerusalem, the city where Christ had been crucified and resurrected, had fallen into Muslim hands centuries earlier. And while Christians were allowed to visit the holy sites, the road there was dangerous and, after the Seljuk victory at Manzikert in 1071, nearly impossible. The Crusades would change history. But what led to them? Well, check out this series, starting with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. Okay, back to Crusades. Since the early days of Islam, Muslim rulers had controlled Jerusalem. But until the 1060s, pilgrims still made the journey from Europe to the city unimpeded. By the late 11th century, though, a pilgrim traveling to Jerusalem might expect anything: extortion, robbery, humiliation, perhaps even death. Whether all the tales were true or exaggerated, one thing was certain: Christendom believed its holiest places were slipping away. The Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, knew his empire was too weak to recover these lands alone. So he did something extraordinary. He asked the West, the Pope in Rome, for help. And in November of 1095, in the French city of Clermont, Pope Urban II responded. No one could have predicted the storm his words would unleash. Here's our show. Now, imagine a sea of people gathering in a cold field outside Clermont. Farmers, knights, priests, nobles, all drawn by rumor. The Pope himself will speak. Urban II was not a young man, but his voice carried with fire. He told them of Christians in the East suffering under foreign rule. He spoke of desecrated churches, of pilgrims beaten and robbed, of holy places defiled. He painted a picture of an enemy that was both alien and threatening, the Seljuk Turks and their Muslim allies, portrayed as destroyers of Christ's heritage. Then, Urban gave them a cause larger than life. He declared that those who took up arms to liberate Jerusalem would be not mercenaries, not mere soldiers, but pilgrims armed with holy purpose. Their sins would be forgiven. Eternal salvation would be theirs. He called it a penitential war. Fight for God, and God would reward you forever. And as he spoke, a cry began to rise from the crowd. Deus vult, Deus vult, God wills it. This was more than a rally. It was ignition. Urban's words spread like wildfire across Europe. Preachers carried his message from village to village, town to town. Knights who had spent their lives fighting petty wars suddenly saw a chance to turn their violence into virtue. Peasants saw the hope of a new life, maybe even land in the East. And ordinary men and women, caught in the poverty and uncertainty of medieval Europe, felt called to take part in a divine mission. But the fever of crusade did not wait for kings and nobles to organize. Before the great lords had even gathered their armies, a wave of ordinary people, peasants, beggars, poor knights, and zealots, took the cross and began to march eastward. This became known as the People's Crusade. At the heart of this movement was a strange and fiery figure, Peter the Hermit. He was small, ragged, riding a donkey, but his voice was thunder. He traveled through towns in Germany and France, whipping up the crowd with visions of holy war. People flocked to him, convinced he was a prophet sent by God. Tens of thousands joined this march. Men, women, even children. They had little food, no real weapons, and no plan. They believed that God would provide. And at first, their journey was filled with joy and hope. Songs were sung on the roads. Crosses were carried high. The dream of Jerusalem burned in their hearts. But reality was cruel. This vast, undisciplined mass needed to eat. As they crossed through Europe, discipline collapsed. Riots broke out. Jewish communities were attacked, massacred by mobs who claimed they were striking the enemies of Christ wherever they found them. Thousands of innocents died in the Rhineland before the People's Crusade had even reached foreign soil. It was a dark foreshadowing of what was to come. When Peter's followers finally crossed into Byzantine lands, they became a burden. Emperor Alexios, who had expected disciplined knights, instead received starving mobs. He hurried them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, hoping they would fight the Turks and perhaps clear a path for the real Crusader armies to follow. It was a disaster. The People's Crusade marched blindly into Seljuk territory. Lured by promises of plunder, they split into groups, raiding villages. But the Turks, skilled horsemen and seasoned warriors, descended on them. In one swift campaign, the crusading mobs were annihilated. Bodies littered the plains. The dreamers were slaughtered. Only fragments survived, among them Peter the Hermit himself, who had left earlier to seek supplies. The People's Crusade was over before it began. And when news of the catastrophe traveled slowly back to the west, a far greater force was already gathering. Urban's call had not only stirred peasants, it had reached the ears of kings, dukes, and princes. Powerful lords began raising armies of trained knights, armored warriors who would not march barefoot like peasants, but ride with banners and lances. Yet the memory of the People's Crusade lingered. The first attempt had ended in fire and blood. Some wondered, was this a sign of God's displeasure? Or was it a test of faith? To the lords and knights preparing to depart, the answer was clear. God demanded not mobs, but warriors. And now, Christendom was ready to send them. Transition, so begins the true story of the First Crusade, not with ragged pilgrims lost in the dust, but with the princes of Europe leading armies across continents. Ahead lay trials of hunger, of betrayal, of unimaginable violence. Ahead lay battles that would shake empires. Ahead lay Jerusalem. But the shadow of the People's Crusade would never fully vanish. It was a reminder of the passion that drove ordinary men and women to abandon everything in the name of God, and of the destruction that passion could unleash. The First Crusade was not just a march to the Holy Land. It was a storm of faith, hope, and fear that would transform the medieval world forever. The year is 1098 and you are watching the siege of Antioch. You can feel the tension in the air, thicker than the dust cloud kicked up by the thousands of crusaders surrounding the city. For 3 months, these men have been camped outside the walls, watching it defiantly from afar. All around you, you hear complaints about the heat, the lack of progress, and the growing piles of corpses in the camp. As a Crusader knight, your visor is fogged with sweat and frustration. Your once white surcoat is caked in grime and the stench of stale waste fills the leathery folds of your gauntlets. The siege of Antioch has become a stalemate. It seems as if you'll soon be forced to return to Europe without capturing the city. But wait, a group of Saracen prisoners just arrived, bearing an offer from the governor, and it could save you from going home in disgrace. Will you accept it? You, like the other Crusaders, have endured much to reach this point. After reuniting in Constantinople, the crusading armies marched west to east through Anatolia. Food was scarce, tempers flared, and disease took hold. But by the middle of 1098, they had reached the outskirts of Antioch, the largest city in the region. This sprawling metropolis, situated on the Orontes River, was a prize worth fighting for. Unfortunately, it was also strongly defended by the Seljuk Turks. Though battered and weary from their travels, the Crusaders laid siege to the city on October. For weeks, the besiegers patiently assembled siege works, catapults, and battering rams. Then, as quickly as the Crusaders completed these machines, the governor, an emir named Yagi Sian, launched counterattacks. He sent out sorties with cavalry and infantry that harassed the Crusader flanks and disrupted their siege efforts. His repeated attacks forced the Crusaders to shift from an investing siege, wherein the army surrounds a city with trenches, and siege works, to a besieging siege, wherein they completely encircled the town, blockading it off from resupply. The Crusaders were confident they would prevail. After all, Antioch had already fallen to them once before in 1084 when the Byzantines had captured it from the Turks. The problem was that the Crusaders were relying on the methods employed by the Byzantines. Since they had arrived in the east, the Crusaders had complained bitterly about the luxurious lifestyle of the court of Constantinople and openly criticized the Byzantine emperors for failing to capture Jerusalem. In hindsight, the Crusaders thought they knew better. Instead of engaging in lengthy sieges, they decided to bypass the regular siege works and try to storm the city gates. If the plan had succeeded, it would have been swift and decisive. But it failed. The Crusaders suffered hundreds of casualties and their attack ended in farce. A few weeks later, the Crusaders tried again, this time diverting the nearby river to flood the moat and open the gate. But the governor anticipated this move and unleashed a horde of cavalry to drive the Crusaders back. The third attempt proved equally disastrous. The Crusaders were forced to retreat in disorder, losing several of their number. Thus, The siege continued and the Crusaders grew desperate. Frustrated and hungry, they were reluctant to lay down their arms. But the question of supplies overshadowed all else. They had been living off the land, foraging for wild plants and hunting small game, but this was not enough. Hunger was a constant companion. Tempers grew shorter. Whispers of abandoning the siege became louder, and talk of returning to Europe gained traction. This was not what any of the princes had envisioned. Despite the desire for Jerusalem, it was clear to all of them that the governor of Antioch would never surrender. This meant they had two options: starve the population out or raise the siege and return home. But the prospect of either option was disheartening. Supplies could be brought in from Europe, but it would take months to arrive. And starving the citizens of Antioch would likely take even longer. Just as morale plummeted, the Knights Hospitaller arrived with provisions. While this did alleviate the worst of the shortages, it wasn't enough to sustain the army for another 3 months. Of course, they could have lifted the siege sooner, but pride prevented this. The Crusaders did not want to retreat without winning a victory. In addition, several lords argued that they should remain in the area and conquer Cilicia before proceeding further east. Others said Jerusalem was their goal and nothing else mattered. It was this internal debate that made the Crusaders vulnerable. Yagisian had been observing them closely. He noted their complaints, their squabbles, their exhaustion, and above all, their hunger. So while the Crusaders debated their future, he planned his counterattack. One evening, Yagisian launched a surprise night attack, breaking into one of the Crusader camps and stealing several wagons laden with food. The next day, he struck again, targeting a different camp. Crusading leaders were forced to rally their troops and beat back the attacks. The Crusaders realized they had been played. Yagisian had bided his time and struck at the right moment. Now he dared them to do something. The situation was becoming untenable. Something had to be done, and the crusading princes knew it. In the end, it was Kerboga Khan, the Atabeg of Damascus, who offered a solution. Kerboga Khan, seeing the internal discord among the Crusaders, had decided to intervene. His proposal was simple. He would lead a relief force to relieve Antioch, and in exchange, the Crusaders would lift the siege. His offer gave them an out, a chance to end the siege without losing face. Moreover, it was too good to refuse. To reject him would mean continuing the siege, which ran the risk of destroying the entire army. Even worse, rumors had spread back home that the Crusaders had already conquered Antioch. If they refused the deal, people in France, Germany, and Italy would think they had lost. On November 28, 1098, the Crusader princes accepted the deal. They abandoned their siege works and prepared to leave. As Kerboga Khan entered Antioch with his army, the Crusader lords were shocked. They had made a grave error. The man they had invited into the region to assist them was now leading an invading force. But it was too late. The die had been cast and Kerboga Khan showed no signs of stopping. At this point, the Crusaders faced a grim choice. They could flee to the safety of Constantinople, abandon the idea of conquering the Holy Land, or they could stand and fight. The decision was unanimous. The princes would fight, but not for the Holy Land. They were now fighting to save face. The battle was joined outside the city walls. The Crusader cavalry smashed into the Muslim ranks, unleashing a storm of steel and fury. Arrows rained, shields buckled, and men fell on both sides. Kerboga Khan proved to be a skilled commander, maneuvering his forces and launching repeated attacks. Despite the valiant defense by the likes of Robert of Flanders and Stephen of Blois, the Crusader center began to waver. Seeing his opportunity, Kerboga Khan ordered a final push. But just as the tide of battle turned decisively in his favor, a rumor swept through the Crusader ranks. Someone had spotted a sizable Byzantine force approaching the battlefield. No one knew if it was true, but the sight of the imperial banners bolstered Crusader morale. Kerboga Khan seized on the moment, convinced that the Byzantines were coming to rescue the Crusaders. He sounded a retreat and his army fell back toward Antioch. The Crusaders had won. The Battle of Antioch marked a turning point in the First Crusade. The princes had proven they could defeat a powerful enemy on the field of battle. However, their victory came at a great cost. As many as 30% of the Crusader army had perished in the siege. Of those who survived, many were injured or sick. If they were going to continue their campaign, they would need to recover. The Prince's Crusade, which had begun with such fanfare, was now a shadow of its former self. Still, the Crusader princes had no intention of turning back. After brief rest, they resumed their advance on Jerusalem. Their goal was now within reach. Before we wrap up today's episode, please make sure you subscribe. The long road south from Antioch to Jerusalem stretched across hundreds of miles of sun-scorched land, through deserts and rocky passes, along rivers that ran low in the summer heat. The Crusaders had survived ambushes, starvation, betrayal, and disease. Now, they were marching toward the prize that had driven them for 4 long years, the Holy City. The army that left Antioch was smaller than the one that had entered it. Thousands of men had perished along the way, their bodies claimed by heat, hunger, or battle. Yet those who remained were hardened by suffering, bound together by faith, and consumed by a single burning desire, Jerusalem. Each day, the soldiers pressed forward with a mixture of hope and dread. Their journey was relentless. Bands of foraging Turks harassed them, striking quickly and disappearing. Wells were scarce, and rivers often brackish. Every mile was a test of endurance. The soldiers learned to live on the barest of rations, and yet, despite exhaustion, morale was fueled by the thought of God's promise. The approach to Jerusalem by June of 1099, the Crusaders glimpsed their goal from afar. The city rose above the hills, golden in the sun, its walls gleaming like a jewel set against the horizon. Jerusalem, the city of Christ, the city that had been the dream, the obsession, the holy mission. For some, the sight inspired awe. For others, it brought fear. Jerusalem was heavily fortified, defended by tens of thousands of soldiers loyal to the Fatimid Caliphate. The walls were high, the gates strong, and the defenders experienced and resolute. But the Crusaders had survived far worse. They would not be turned away now. The siege of Jerusalem, the siege began in earnest in mid-June 1099. The Crusaders surrounded the city, building towers, digging trenches, and attempting to breach the walls with ladders and battering rams. The defenders responded with relentless counterattacks, arrows, stones, boiling oil, and sorties to burn siege engines. Hunger gnawed at both sides. The heat of the summer sun baked the Crusader camp. Soldiers were reduced to eating whatever they could find, even resorting to leather and roots. Disease spread through the ranks, claiming lives that battle had spared. Yet, in the midst of suffering, faith burned brighter than ever. They believed that God Himself guided them. Days turned into weeks. Each assault met fierce resistance. Ladders were held down, towers set ablaze, soldiers cut down in waves. But the Crusaders were relentless. They prayed, they fought, they endured. The final assault. On July 14, 1099, after weeks of siege, the Crusaders launched a final, coordinated assault. Siege towers were rolled into position, ladders raised against the walls. Knights charged, shield against shield, sword against spear. Every inch of the wall was contested with blood and fire. By July 15th, the walls were breached. Crusaders poured into the city, their cries mixing with the screams of the defenders. What followed was a massacre on a scale that shocked even the hardened soldiers. Thousands of Muslims and Jews were killed, the streets running with blood. Jerusalem had fallen, but the cost in human life was staggering. The Crusaders believed their actions were justified by divine will. They were, in their eyes, liberators of the holy places. Yet the brutality left scars on the city and on history itself. Godfrey of Bouillon and the Kingdom of Jerusalem after the fall, the Crusaders faced the question of leadership. Godfrey of Bouillon, respected for his piety and valor, was chosen as ruler. But he refused the title of king. Instead, he became defender of the Holy Sepulchre, honoring the city's sacred significance rather than claiming temporal power. Crusader states were established across the region: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These territories would form the foundation for nearly a century of Western presence in the Levant, though they were constantly threatened by local powers. Aftermath and legacy: the First Crusade changed the world forever. Jerusalem was in Christian hands for the first time in centuries. European knights had proven they could wage long-distance war in foreign lands. Trade routes opened, contact between East and West increased, and knowledge and culture flowed between continents. Yet the Crusade also left a legacy of violence, religious intolerance, and deep-seated mistrust between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. The memory of massacre, of blood in the streets of Jerusalem, would echo for centuries, shaping relations and conflicts in the region. For Europe, the Crusade ignited a new sense of religious fervor. Pilgrimages and military campaigns became intertwined. The idea that faith could justify warfare, that salvation could be won with the sword, took root and would inspire generations of knights and armies. For the Crusaders themselves, The journey had been transformative. They had endured deserts, mountains, starvation, and battle. They had witnessed miracles, faced betrayal, and conquered against impossible odds. And finally, standing on the streets of Jerusalem, they could claim victory, though the price had been unimaginably high. The First Crusade was a story of faith, ambition, blood, and endurance. It was a crucible that forged new leaders, redrew maps, and defined the relationship between Europe and the Near East for generations. Jerusalem was captured, but the reverberations of that capture would echo across centuries, an enduring testament to the power of belief, the brutality of war, and the complex tapestry of human history.